Welcome to our channel. What would you do if the house you inherited began whispering secrets of the past? The house on Hillside Lane was grand, with its weathered shingles and ivy-covered stone walls. It stood at the outskirts of a small, sleepy town, charming to the townsfolk but deeply unsettling to me. When my Aunt Martha passed away, she left this house to me in her will. As a child, I was fascinated by the place, though always from a distance. The idea of living there was both exciting and terrifying. After I moved in, the first few days were spent unpacking and exploring the spacious rooms. The high ceilings and large windows let in plenty of light during the day, but as the sun set, the shadows seemed to come alive. Each night, I heard footsteps from the attic, rhythmic and deliberate. At first, I dismissed it as the house-settling old houses have their creaks and groans, right? But these footsteps, they felt intentional, as if someone or something was walking above me. Curiosity got the better of me one evening, and armed with a flashlight, I ascended the narrow stairs to the attic. The air grew colder with each step, the familiar smell of dust and old books filling my nose. The attic was cluttered with boxes, but there was no one there. The footsteps stopped the moment I arrived. Disappointed, I returned to my room. But the next night, the footsteps returned, this time louder, more persistent. Frustrated, I climbed to the attic again. And again, nothing. The eerie consistency of these sounds was impossible to ignore. Then came something far more terrifying. A trail of muddy footprints appeared one morning, leading from the front door to the staircase near my bedroom. But the most disturbing part, there were no footprints leading back outside. I began to research the history of the house, and what I found shook me to my core. The house on Hillside Lane once belonged to a man named Harold Greaves, who was known to dabble in the occult. His strange rituals often disturbed the neighbors. One stormy night, Harold vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing, not even a footprint. The house passed from owner to owner, each reporting the same unsettling feelings, the same sounds of footsteps echoing through the halls. Determined not to be chased away, I sought the help of a local medium. Together, we conducted a ritual to release Harold's spirit, bound by his failed quest for immortality. The night of the ritual, I felt a presence in the attic, and for the first time, the apparition of Harold Greaves appeared before me. He didn't speak, but I could sense his torment. His face conveyed what words couldn't: a life trapped between worlds. As the final words of the ritual were spoken, Harold's apparition slowly faded, dissolving into a gentle light that vanished through the attic window. The house has been quiet since that night. No more footsteps, no more muddy footprints. Sometimes I still feel his presence, but it's no longer menacing. The house on Hillside Lane and Harold are finally at peace. Are you ready to discover more ghost stories like this? Subscribe to the channel for more true scary stories and join us as we explore the most chilling tales of the paranormal. Story 2. Have you ever seen someone who shouldn't exist? It was late autumn when I first noticed her. Wrapped in a tattered gray coat, she always sat at the back of the night bus I drove. Her face, pale and translucent under the dim lights, carried a quiet sadness. She boarded the bus every night at exactly 11:15 p.m., slipping her fare into the box without a word and taking her usual seat. What made her different from the regulars was her silence, her isolation. She never carried anything with her: no bag, no belongings, just the weight of a story I couldn't yet understand. For weeks, I watched her through the rearview mirror, curious about who she was, where she was going. The regular passengers had become familiar over time, exchanging nods or brief conversations, but not her. She was like a shadow, a ghostly figure in the mundane night. Each night, she was the last to leave the bus, stepping off into the desolate outskirts, right before the final stop. One night, driven by a mix of curiosity and concern, I decided to follow her. The bus hissed to a stop, and I watched as she slipped off, her coat billowing slightly in the breeze. Securing the bus, I followed her discreetly into the shadows of the deserted lot. The moon was a thin crescent, casting just enough light for me to see her silhouette move towards the thick woods that bordered the lot. Suddenly, she stopped at the edge of the trees, her head turning slightly as if sensing my presence. I ducked behind a tree, holding my breath. She paused for a long moment, then disappeared into the darkness. I hurried after her, but when I reached the spot where she had vanished, there was nothing. No path through the trees, no trace of her footsteps, nothing but the rustle of the wind. For weeks after, I waited for her to return, scanning the rearview mirror at 11:15 p.m., but she never came again. It was as if she had never existed at all, a figment of my imagination or a spirit who had only briefly crossed into my world. I asked around, describing her to other drivers and passengers, but no one had ever seen her. It was as though she had been a ghost, a lost soul passing through, and I was left haunted by the mystery of the woman in the tattered coat. Story 3. What if your reflection had a life of its own? It was an ordinary Thursday evening when Sarah's world turned upside down. She had spent the day at her busy marketing firm, managing deadlines and navigating endless meetings. Tired and seeking solace, she decided to wind down with a glass of wine and a good book. After a long bath, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her reflection fogged over from the steam. As the mist cleared, she felt a strange sensation, like she was being watched. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was off. She paused, narrowing her eyes. It's just my imagination, she thought. But then it happened, her reflection blinked, out of sync with her own eyes. Sarah froze, her heart pounding. She blinked deliberately once, twice, but the reflection didn't follow. Instead, it smiled, an eerie, unsettling smile that didn't belong to her. Panic washed over her, but curiosity pushed her to stay. She raised her hand to the glass, mirroring the reflection, but what she felt wasn't cold, smooth glass, it was pressure, like something was pushing back from the other side. Terror took over as her reflection's hand pressed harder against the mirror, its smile growing wider. Desperate for answers, Sarah grabbed her phone and recorded herself standing before the mirror. "Blink if you're real," she commanded, her voice shaky. Her reflection didn't blink, it winked. She dropped the phone in shock, watching as her reflection's eyes gleamed with a malice that was completely foreign to her. Sarah ran from the room, but the image of that twisted smile lingered in her mind. Story 4. Would you open the door if a stranger warned you to stay inside? The first whisper came on a night wrapped in quiet darkness. My phone vibrated softly on the nightstand, the clock striking midnight. I picked it up, groggy and confused. The screen read, "Unknown caller." A hushed voice spoke through the static, "Watch the windows." Before I could respond, the line went dead. The next morning, my phone showed no record of the call. I wrote it off as a prank, albeit a creepy one. But the following night, it happened again. This time, the whisper warned, "Lock your doors." The precision of the calls unnerved me, each night bringing a new warning, always at midnight. I set up a camera to record my nightstand, desperate for proof. The seventh call came with the most chilling message yet. "Look behind you." Chills raced down my spine as I instinctively scanned the room. But there was nothing. No intruder, no shadows, just the quiet hum of the night. The police were skeptical when I presented the footage. They offered no solid answers, but the warnings continued. Then, one night, I heard glass shatter downstairs. Heart pounding, I grabbed the baseball bat I'd started keeping by my bed. Creeping down the stairs, I saw a shadow move across the room. It wasn't a threat, it was a warning. The calls had been guiding me to this moment. Story 5. Have you ever been warned by something you couldn't see? A series of break-ins had shaken the quiet neighborhood. Garages were being targeted, including mine twice. The first time, they took a box of old records and some tools. The second time, a bicycle disappeared. Frustrated, I decided to install a security camera inside the garage. The first few nights, the camera caught nothing unusual, just a few raccoons scurrying by. Then, one morning, I reviewed the footage and saw something that sent chills down my spine. At exactly 3 a.m., the garage door opened slowly from the inside. I watched, bewildered, as I walked into the frame. The only problem? I had no memory of it. The footage showed me sleepwalking, my eyes unfocused, staring blankly ahead. But then I began to whisper to someone just off screen. The camera didn't have audio, but it was clear I was speaking to someone or something that wasn't visible on camera. After a brief conversation, I walked back into the house, leaving the door wide open. I was confused, disturbed by what I had seen. Who was I talking to? What was happening while I slept? The next night, I set up another camera, this time aimed at the outside of the garage, hoping to capture more. Again, the footage revealed me walking out at 3 a.m., speaking to an invisible figure. This time, I reached out as if to touch someone. The mystery deepened when I added an audio recorder. The whisper I captured was my own voice saying, "It's safe now, they're all asleep." Story 6. What if your childhood fears weren't imaginary after all? Elliot had never forgotten the nights when he was a child, lying in bed, listening to the sound of breathing coming from under his bed. It had terrified him then, but he had always convinced himself it was just his imagination. Now, standing in his daughter Lucy's room, the memories came flooding back. "Daddy, there's something breathing under my bed," Lucy whispered, clutching her teddy bear. Heart pounding, Elliot mustered a reassuring smile. "Let's check it out together." As they approached the bed, Elliot's hands shook. Slowly, he knelt and lifted the bed skirt. His breath caught in his throat when he saw them two gleaming eyes staring back at him. He recoiled, his heart racing. "Stay back, Lucy." He grabbed a flashlight and shone it under the bed. But instead of a creature, he found a small dusty box. Inside were old photos and childhood toys he barely remembered. The eyes, he realized, were just reflections of light on something metallic inside the box. That night, Elliot lay awake, haunted by his childhood memories. The box was filled with fragments of his past, and yet there was something unsettling about it. The next day, he visited his mother, bringing the box with him. Over cups of tea, his mother's face paled as she recognized the items. "I thought you were just having nightmares back then," she said. But there was always something strange about that house. Elliot's mother recounted stories of strange occurrences, things that had never made sense. And as Elliot listened, he realized that his childhood fears may not have been imaginary after all. Story 7. Would you chase a missing hour of your life? In the quiet corner of my town, I began noticing something strange. Every night at precisely 3:15 a.m., time would inexplicably jump forward to 4:15 a.m. At first, I thought it was a glitch in my old clock, but when a new digital clock skipped the same hour, I started to feel uneasy. Determined to figure out what was happening, I set up a camera in my bedroom, hoping to capture any odd occurrences. The first night, the camera caught something that would haunt me forever. At 3:15 a.m., I suddenly sat up in bed, climbed out, and walked to the window. There, I stood for the entire missing hour, staring into the darkness with a serene yet unsettling smile on my face. Then, at 4:15 a.m., I calmly returned to bed as though nothing had happened. Each night, this behavior repeated, with me standing at the window, smiling at something unseen. Desperate for answers, I tried staying awake to experience the hour for myself, but as 3:15 a.m. approached, I felt an overwhelming urge to look out the window. I resisted, writing down everything I felt. And when time jumped forward again, I was left with an eerie sense of loss, like I had missed something extraordinary. I enlisted a friend to help. We set up infrared cameras outside the window, and the next night we saw a soft, pulsating light that seemed to have no source. The air grew colder, the camera started to glitch, and a faint humming filled the room. We watched as the light danced and swirled outside, almost sentient in its movements. The light vanished at 4:15 a.m., and the missing hour was over. Story 8. Would you accept an invitation to dinner from a dead man? Michael found the dinner invitation nailed to his front door one chilly autumn evening. The heavy cardstock, embossed with elegant swirling script, invited him to a dinner at the neighboring estate, the very house where his neighbor Harold Greystone had lived and died 2 years earlier. Michael stared at the invitation in disbelief. Harold had been a strange man, known for his eccentricities and vast wealth. His death had been sudden and mysterious, and no one had come forward to claim his estate. The mansion had fallen into disrepair, and the thought of receiving an invitation from beyond the grave was chilling, to say the least. Compelled by curiosity, Michael decided to investigate. The mansion was next door, but it had always felt worlds away, with its high walls and dense foliage. On the night of the supposed dinner, Michael dressed in semi-formal attire and approached the mansion as the setting sun cast long shadows over the grounds. The gate, usually rusted shut, creaked open, and Michael stepped inside. To his surprise, the interior was immaculate. A long dining table, set for two, awaited him in the grand dining room. Candles flickered, casting soft light across gleaming silverware. Then, a voice came from behind him. "Michael, how wonderful to see you." Heart pounding, Michael turned to find Harold older, but undeniably Harold standing before him, alive. "You're supposed to be dead," Michael stammered. Harold smiled. "Please, sit. I'll explain everything." Over the course of dinner, Harold revealed that his death had been staged. He was part of a secret society, and he had faked his death to complete a dangerous task. But now he needed Michael. "You're part of this story too," Harold said, his eyes gleaming with a strange mixture of sincerity and mischief. This second batch of scary stories and horror tales dives deeper into the unknown. If you're enjoying these true scary stories, don't forget to subscribe for even more spine-chilling content. Story 9. Would you feel safe if someone was watching you while you slept? Living alone had always been my preference. The silence of the apartment was a sanctuary from the bustling world outside, and I cherished the privacy. But that sense of control began to erode one autumn morning when I found the first Polaroid. It was tucked neatly into the corner of my dresser drawer, hidden beneath a pile of folded t-shirts. The image depicted me, sound asleep in my bed, the covers drawn up to my chin. The timestamp in the corner read 2:07 a.m. from just a few nights prior. A chill ran down my spine. I lived alone. How could someone have taken this photo? At first, I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was an old photo or a prank by someone who'd once had access to my apartment. But the following day brought another photo. This one slipped under my pillow. In it, I was lying in bed, my face turned toward the camera, still asleep. The next photo showed me sleeping in a different position, and then another, all taken at the same time, 2:07 a.m. Panicking, I changed the locks, installed a security camera, and began staying up late, waiting for something to happen. But every night, the camera captured nothing. No signs of an intruder, no sounds. Yet the photos kept appearing. Desperate for answers, I turned to the police, but they found no evidence of forced entry. Their only theory was that someone might be playing an elaborate prank. They suggested it could be a former friend, or maybe even a stalker. Despite their increased patrols in the area, the photos continued to appear. One night, as I lay awake, pretending to sleep, I watched the camera feed on my phone. That's when I noticed a faint shimmer in the corner of the room, like heat haze. Frozen with fear, I watched as the shimmer began to take shape, forming a humanoid figure. It held a Polaroid camera. The figure moved around the room silently, snapping a photo before slipping it into my dresser. As the figure faded into the darkness, my blood ran cold. This was no ordinary intruder. Story 10. What would you do if you met your doppelganger? James had always felt ordinary, the kind of man who blended into a crowd without a second glance. But that changed one crisp autumn day when he encountered someone who looked exactly like him. It happened during a routine lunch break walk through the bustling downtown streets. James passed a familiar row of shops when he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a window, or at least, he thought it was his reflection. Standing inside the shop, looking out at him, was a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to James. They locked eyes, both frozen in place. The man inside the shop smiled and waved before disappearing into the depths of the store. Confused and intrigued, James hurried inside, weaving through the aisles until he found the man browsing a stack of books. "Excuse me," James said, his voice betraying his bewilderment. "This might sound strange, but you look exactly like me." The man looked up, his smile still in place. "Do I?" he said, his tone light and almost dismissive. "I hadn't noticed." James insisted on trying to engage the man in conversation, but each question was met with evasive answers. Finally, James took out his phone. "Can I take a picture with you? My friends will never believe this." The man hesitated, his smile fading slightly. Then he relented. "All right, just this once." They stood side by side, and James snapped a few photos, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and an inexplicable dread. After parting ways, James rushed back to his office, eager to show his colleagues the photographic proof of his bizarre encounter. But when he looked at the photos on his phone, his blood ran cold. The photos showed James standing alone, smiling awkwardly at the camera. The man was gone. "That's a great selfie, James, but why the fuss?" a coworker joked. James felt a chill wash over him. The man who looked just like him had vanished from the photos, as if he had never been there at all. As the days passed, James became obsessed with finding his doppelganger again, searching the city streets and even returning to the shop where he'd seen him. But no matter where he looked, the man never reappeared. Was it all in his head, or had he stumbled upon something far more sinister? Story 11. Would you follow the voices that call to you through the fog? It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Every Thursday night, without fail, a thick, impenetrable fog would roll into our street from the nearby river. At first, I dismissed it as a typical autumn weather pattern, but it was the voices that turned the fog from a mere inconvenience into a haunting mystery. The first time I heard them, I had stepped outside to grab the mail I'd forgotten earlier that day. The fog was so dense that the streetlights were reduced to faint glows, barely piercing through the mist. As I walked down the driveway, I heard it a whisper, soft and fleeting, so faint I thought it was the rustle of leaves. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Join us." The voice was unsettlingly calm, almost inviting. I spun around, peering into the fog, but there was nothing. The street was empty, silent save for the whispering mist. I hurried back inside, dismissing the voice as a trick of my imagination. But the following Thursday, the voices returned. They varied in tone and number, sometimes a lone voice, other times a chorus of whispers, all beckoning, "Come join us." Determined to understand what was happening, I asked my neighbors if they had noticed anything strange on foggy nights. Most hadn't heard a thing, but old Mrs. Jensen from across the street leaned in close and whispered, "The voices. You hear them too." She told me that years ago, her husband had heard the voices calling to him from the fog. One night he had followed them and was found the next morning, wandering the riverbank, confused but unharmed. He never spoke of it again, and Mrs. Jensen had dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man's mind. The revelation only deepened the mystery. The following Thursday, I prepared myself. Armed with a flashlight and a voice recorder, I ventured into the fog when the voices began. They grew louder as I followed them down the street, leading me toward the park at the edge of town. The fog was thicker there, so dense it felt like I was walking through clouds. The voices called out to me, more desperate now. "Help us. We're lost." Eventually, I reached the old bridge that spanned the river. The whispers crescendoed into a chorus of sorrowful pleas. "Here we fell. Help us rise." The story unfolded in my mind as I stood on the bridge. Decades ago, a ferry had capsized on a night much like this, and many of its passengers were swept away by the river's treacherous currents. Their bodies were recovered downstream, but it seemed their spirits had never left. Moved by their plight, I stood in silence on the bridge, offering words of remembrance and peace. As the fog began to lift with the first light of dawn, the voices faded. That Thursday, the fog returned, but the voices were gone. Instead, there was only a serene silence, as though the spirits had finally found peace. Story 12. Would you trust a shortcut you'd never seen before? David's morning started like any other. He grabbed his coffee, packed his bag, and began his commute to the office. But that day, the thickest fog he'd ever seen had settled over the town, obscuring the world in a pale, ghostly mist. As David drove his usual route, the fog seemed to swallow the road, blurring the familiar landmarks until they became indistinct shadows. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, squinting to make out the street signs. That's when he noticed a side street he'd never seen before, veiled in mist. Curiosity piqued, David turned onto the narrow road, eager to escape the suffocating fog. The road was lined with gnarled trees that formed a tunnel of branches overhead, their leaves whispering as he passed beneath them. The further he drove, the more disoriented he became. Minutes stretched into an hour, and soon, David realized he was lost. His GPS flickered erratically, displaying confusing directions that led him in circles. Each attempt to follow the instructions brought him back to the same dead-end clearing, surrounded by dense woods. Frustrated, David stopped the car and stepped out, hoping to get his bearings. But the moment his feet touched the ground, the eerie silence of the forest enveloped him. No birds, no wind, only the oppressive stillness of the fog. David retraced his steps, trying different turns, but no matter which way he went, he always ended up back at the same clearing. Panic set in as the sun arched towards noon. Was he trapped in a supernatural loop, or had he simply gone mad? Story 13. What if you discovered a painting from your past? It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when Anna wandered into a small, cluttered thrift store on the edge of town. The shop was a mishmash of vintage clothing, worn furniture, and forgotten trinkets piled high on shelves. It was the kind of place she loved, where every item had a story. Her eyes roved the store, absorbing the chaos, until they landed on a small painting hung carelessly between a rusty bicycle and a tarnished mirror. The painting was old, its frame cracked and worn, but it was the scene depicted inside that stole her breath. It was a painting of a forest clearing, sunlight piercing through the trees to illuminate a circle of stones. 2 children, a boy and a girl, sat in the middle, engrossed in a game of marbles. The boy's hair was sandy, just like her brother's, and the girl's braids mirrored how Anna used to wear hers as a child. It was a scene from her childhood, a secret place only she and her brother had known. Compelled by an eerie sense of familiarity, Anna bought the painting. The store's elderly owner gave her a curious look but said nothing as he wrapped the painting in brown paper. Once home, Anna hung the painting in her living room, feeling both comforted and unsettled by its presence. As the days passed, she found herself drawn to it, studying the brushstrokes, the colors, the way the light filtered through the leaves. She couldn't shake the feeling that the painting held a secret. Determined to uncover its origins, she returned to the thrift store and pressed the owner for information. After much coaxing, he revealed that the painting had come from an estate sale, from the home of a reclusive artist who had lived on the outskirts of town. Armed with this information, Anna sought out the artist's abandoned cottage deep in the woods. What she found there chilled her to the bone, a real-life version of the clearing depicted in the painting. The same circle of stones. The same sense of stillness. Had the artist been spying on her as a child, or was there something deeper connecting them? Anna dug into local archives, and what she discovered shocked her. The artist, Eleanor Rigby, had been her grandmother's best friend. They had grown up together, sharing their lives and secrets that had somehow ended up on the canvas. The painting wasn't just a memory. It was a connection to a past Anna had never known existed. Story 14. Would you press a mysterious elevator button for the 13th floor? As an IT specialist at a bustling downtown law firm, late nights were common for me. The office was housed in one of the city's oldest buildings, with an antique facade and brass fixtures that spoke of a different era. But the most peculiar thing about the building was the elevator. The panel inside showed buttons for floors 1 through 12, but sometimes late at night when I was alone, the button for the 13th floor would light up. I assumed it was just a glitch. Many old buildings skip the 13th floor due to superstition, but something about this felt different. One Thursday night, after finishing a long server update, I stepped into the elevator, exhausted. The office was eerily silent, emptied of its usual hustle and bustle. As the doors closed, I noticed the 13th floor button glowing faintly. Without thinking, I pressed it. The elevator began its ascent, but the ride felt strange. There was a subtle vibration, an electric tension in the air, as if the elevator itself was surprised that someone had dared to visit this forbidden floor. When the doors opened, I expected to see another office level. Instead, I found myself in a dimly lit corridor that mirrored the layout of my usual workspace, but everything was shrouded in shadows. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie patterns on the walls, and the air smelled musty, as though the floor hadn't been used in years. Hesitantly, I stepped out, my footsteps echoing in the silence. That's when I saw them. Figures, sitting at their desks, heads bowed as if engrossed in work, but none of them moved. None of them even acknowledged my presence. As I approached one of the figures, dread pooled in my stomach. It wasn't a person. It was a mannequin. Each desk was occupied by a faceless mannequin, dressed to look like my coworkers, posed in lifelike positions with props like coffee mugs and laptops. The surreal sight made my skin crawl. Curiosity battled with fear as I ventured deeper into the floor. That's when I found what would have been my own workspace. There on the desk was a folder labeled case files. Inside, every page was blank, except for one phrase repeated over and over. Do not look behind you. Story 15. Would you brave the woods alone if you knew something was watching you? I've always found solace in the great outdoors. The quiet of the forest, the fresh air, the sense of escape from city life. It was my sanctuary. Hiking had become my weekend ritual, and the trails of old pine forest were my favorite, with their sprawling canopy and hidden groves. But over time, a sense of unease began to creep into my solitary hikes. It started subtly, flickers of movement out of the corner of my eye, the rustle of leaves that seemed to follow me. At first, I told myself it was just wildlife. Deer, maybe, or foxes. After all, creatures were common in old pine. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every hike left me more unsettled than the last. Determined to confront my fears, I ventured deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone before. The trees here were older, their massive trunks gnarled with age, their branches creating a dense tapestry above. The deeper I went, the heavier the sensation of eyes upon me became. Finally, I stopped. Pulling out my camera, I decided to capture the beauty of the forest, to remind myself there was nothing to fear. The shutter clicked crisply in the quiet as I snapped several photos of the trees, the sunlight streaming through the leaves. But when I reviewed the photos later that evening, I froze. In each photo, just behind the trees, was a dark figure. Story 16. Would you take a train ride into the unknown? It was a cold, misty night when I found myself at the old train station, staring up at the departure board. I hadn't planned to be there, but something had drawn me to the station, an inexplicable pull I couldn't ignore. The station was empty, save for a single train that stood waiting on the platform. The departure board flickered, displaying the destination as unknown. A chill ran down my spine as I approached the train, the mist swirling around my feet. The doors hissed open, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The interior of the train was eerily quiet. There were no passengers, no conductor, just row after row of empty seats. The lights overhead flickered as I made my way down the aisle, settling into a seat near the back. The doors closed with a soft thud, and the train began to move. As it picked up speed, the mist outside grew thicker, obscuring the world beyond the windows. I felt a growing sense of dread, as though I had boarded a train bound for somewhere I wasn't meant to go. Hours passed, and still the train sped on, never stopping. My heart pounded as I stared out the window, but all I could see was the mist, swirling endlessly. It was then that I noticed something strange, a figure standing in the aisle, staring at me. I hadn't heard anyone board the train. The figure was dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, his face pale and expressionless. He said nothing, just stood there, watching me with empty eyes. The train didn't stop. Story 17. Would you spend the night in a haunted hotel room? The faded neon sign flickered above the old roadside motel, casting eerie shadows over the cracked pavement. I had been driving for hours, and the prospect of a bed, even one in a place like this, was too tempting to pass up. The clerk at the front desk handed me the key without a word, his eyes tired and uninterested. Room 217. The hallway smelled of dust and old carpet, and the door to my room groaned as I pushed it open. The room itself was standard: a faded bedspread, a TV that looked like it hadn't worked in years, and a small bathroom with chipped tiles. I tossed my bag on the bed and collapsed beside it, exhaustion overtaking me. It wasn't until the lights began flickering that I realized something was off. At first, I dismissed it as faulty wiring. After all, the motel looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. But then, the flickering became rhythmic, almost deliberate. That's when I heard it, the sound of someone moving in the room above me. Except, the clerk had mentioned I was the only guest that night. I brushed it off, trying to convince myself that maybe the clerk had been mistaken. But as I lay there, the sounds grew louder. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, pacing back and forth above me. Curiosity and a growing sense of dread drove me to investigate. I left my room, climbed the stairs, and approached the door to the room directly above mine. Room 317. The door was slightly ajar, and a chill ran down my spine as I pushed it open. The room was identical to mine, except for one unsettling detail: there was no bed, no furniture. Just an empty room with a single chair in the center, facing the window. And on that chair sat a figure, motionless, staring out into the night. The figure slowly turned to look at me, but before I could react, the door slammed shut. Story 18. What if the voice on the phone wasn't a prank? It started with a simple phone call. Unknown number flashed on the screen, but I didn't think much of it. When I answered, there was nothing on the other end but static. "Hello?" I asked, growing impatient. Still, nothing but the faint crackle of white noise. I hung up, thinking it was a glitch or some telemarketer. But then the calls started coming more frequently. Every day at the same time, 7:13 p.m. The phone would ring, and the same static-filled silence would greet me. At first, it was an annoyance, but over time, it became something much darker. The first time I heard the whisper, I thought I had imagined it. A faint voice, barely audible through the static, saying my name. That's impossible, I told myself. It had to be a coincidence, a trick of the mind. But the next day, the voice came again, clearer this time. Are you alone? Chills ran down my spine as I hung up, my heart pounding. I blocked the number, but the calls kept coming. The next night, the same question, are you alone? I stopped answering the phone after that, letting the calls go to voicemail. But even then, the voicemails were nothing but static, and the faint whisper of my name. One night, I decided to stay with a friend, hoping to escape the terrifying calls. But at exactly 7:13 p.m., my friend's phone rang. Her face paled as she answered, her eyes locking on mine. The voice on the other end wasn't asking if I was alone anymore. It was telling me. Story 19. What if the past could haunt you in ways you never imagined? The old typewriter had been in my family for generations. My grandfather had used it to write letters during the war. My father used it for his work as a journalist, and now it sat in my study, collecting dust. I had no real use for it, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. There was something about its history, its presence, that felt important. One rainy afternoon, I found myself drawn to it. On a whim, I rolled a piece of paper into the typewriter and began to type. The keys felt stiff, but they still worked. The rhythmic click-clack filled the room as I typed a few random sentences. But when I pulled the paper out to read what I had written, my heart skipped a beat. The words on the page weren't mine. It was a letter. A letter from my grandfather, written in his distinctive, neat style. But it wasn't one of the letters I had read before. This one was different. My dearest, if you're reading this, I've gone. The house is no longer safe. The spirits that haunt it, they're not at peace. They want something from us, and I've been keeping them at bay. But now it's your turn. I stared at the letter in disbelief, my hands trembling. My grandfather had passed away years ago, and I had never seen this letter before. How had it appeared on the paper I'd just typed on? I rolled in another sheet of paper and began typing again. This time, the words came out in my father's handwriting. Story 20. Would you ever return to a house that tried to kill you? The house at the end of Willow Street had always been abandoned, or so I thought. Growing up, it was the house all the kids avoided, the one we dared each other to get close to, but never actually entered. It was old, with boarded up windows, peeling paint, and a sagging roof that made it look like it was ready to collapse at any moment. But one night, as I walked home, I saw a light in the window. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the house. The closer I got, the more certain I was that someone was inside. The light flickered, casting strange shadows across the lawn. As I stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaked beneath my weight. I hesitated for a moment, then reached for the doorknob. To my surprise, the door swung open on its own, revealing a dark hallway. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The air inside was thick, musty, as if the house hadn't been touched in years. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I heard it before I saw it. A soft rustling, like someone moving through the shadows. I froze, listening, my eyes straining to see in the darkness. And then, from the far end of the hallway, I saw her. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing at the top of the staircase. Her eyes were locked on mine, and in that moment, I knew this house wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. Story 21. Can a cursed object truly control your life? The mirror had been a gift from a distant relative, passed down through the generations. It was old, its ornate gold frame tarnished with age, and its surface slightly warped. My mother had always kept it in the attic, saying it was too strange to be displayed in the house. But after she passed away, I decided to bring it down and hang it in the hallway. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The mirror reflected the hallway like any other. But over time, I began to notice something strange. My reflection wasn't quite right. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of movement out of sync with my own. I'd raise my hand to smooth my hair, and for a split second, the reflection would lag behind. I told myself it was just my imagination, or perhaps the warping of the old glass. But soon, the discrepancies became impossible to ignore. My reflection would smile when I wasn't smiling. It would stand still when I walked past. One night, I decided to confront it. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection, waiting for it to move out of turn. It did. My reflection raised its hand, even though mine stayed at my side. It smiled that eerie, unnatural smile, and then it spoke. "You belong to me now." Story 22. Would you dare open a door you've been told never to touch? In my grandfather's old house, there was a door at the end of the hallway that had always been locked. Growing up, I was told never to go near it, never to ask about it, and certainly never to try to open it. I wasn't even sure where it led. There was no indication from the outside of what could be behind it. Grandfather had passed away years ago, and now the house belonged to me. My childhood curiosity about the mysterious door had never faded, and one evening, I found myself standing in front of it again. I ran my fingers over the cold brass doorknob, hesitating before making a decision. I was going to open it. It took some effort to pry the old door open. The lock had rusted, and the door itself seemed swollen with time. When it finally creaked open, the air inside rushed past me, cold and musty. A set of narrow, spiraling stairs descended into darkness, a place that had clearly not been disturbed in decades. Grabbing a flashlight, I carefully made my way down. The stairs led to a small room, a basement of sorts, though it felt older than the house itself. The walls were made of rough stone, and the floor was dirt. But what caught my attention was a wooden chest in the center of the room, covered in dust. I approached cautiously, heart pounding, and opened the chest. Inside were old photographs, hundreds of them. They were all of children, but none of the faces were familiar. And then I found the letters, each one dated decades ago, all written by children, pleading for help. They spoke of a man, someone they called the Watcher, who took them from their homes, never to be seen again. As I rifled through the letters, a cold wind swept through the room. The flashlight flickered, and then I heard it, a soft, malevolent whisper from the darkness behind me. Story 23. What if your daily routine was interrupted by a chilling discovery? It began innocently enough with a routine visit to the local library. I was in the middle of a research project for work, and the library had become my second home over the past few weeks. Most days it was quiet, just me and a few other regulars, going about our business in silence. But that day was different. As I entered the building, I immediately felt that something was off. The air was colder than usual, and there was a faint smell, something metallic, like rust. Dismissing it as nothing, I made my way to my usual spot, a table in the far corner near the back of the library. That's when I saw the book. It wasn't one I had pulled from the shelves, and it definitely wasn't one I recognized. Its cover was worn, the leather cracked and faded, with no title to indicate what it was about. Curious, I opened it. The first page was blank. So was the second and the third. But as I flipped further, words began to appear. They were written in a spidery, shaky hand, and they told a story about someone who had found a similar book. The narrative was vague at first, but the deeper I read, the more unsettling it became. The book described the reader me down to the clothes I was wearing, the table I was sitting at. The words on the page seemed to change, describing my movements in real time. I shut the book, my heart racing, and looked around the library. There was no one else in sight. I tried to leave, but as I stood up, the lights flickered and went out. the library was plunged into darkness. I heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and the book fell open on the table, its pages flipping on their own. A new line appeared on the last page. Don't turn around. Story 24. Would you open the window if someone on the other side knocked? The storm had been raging for hours, the wind howling through the trees outside my bedroom window. Rain lashed against the glass, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the room in brief, eerie bursts. It was one of those nights where sleep seemed impossible, the weather too wild to ignore. At around 2 a.m., just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard a soft, deliberate knock on the window. My heart leapt into my throat. I lived on the second floor of a small apartment complex, with no balconies or fire escapes. No one should have been able to reach my window. But there it was again, 3 soft knocks, like someone gently tapping their knuckles against the glass. Terrified, but unable to resist my curiosity, I slowly turned to face the window. At first, I saw nothing but the rain-splattered glass. Then, in the next flash of lightning, I saw it. A figure was standing outside, staring at me through the window. I bolted upright, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall, dressed in dark, soaking wet clothes, their face obscured by the shadows. They knocked again, their hand pressing gently against the glass. I scrambled out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. As I backed away from the window, the figure leaned in closer, their face coming into view. Their eyes were empty, hollow, like they weren't human at all. And then, with another flash of lightning, they were gone, just as quickly as they had appeared. But the knocking didn't stop. Story 25. What if your dreams weren't just in your mind? For as long as I could remember, I had been having the same recurring dream. It always started the same way. I was walking through a dense fog, unable to see more than a few feet in front of me. The ground beneath my feet was soft, almost marsh-like, and the air was thick with moisture. In the dream, I always ended up at the same place, an old house, crumbling and overgrown with vines. It stood in the middle of the fog, its windows dark and lifeless. Every time, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as I approached the house, but I was never able to stop myself from entering. Inside, the air was cold, and the floors creaked under my weight. I would wander through the rooms, each one more dilapidated than the last, until I reached the door at the end of the hallway. Behind that door, I knew something terrible awaited me, but I could never bring myself to open it. I would wake up, drenched in sweat, just as my hand touched the doorknob. For years, I dismissed the dream as nothing more than my subconscious playing tricks on me. But then, one day, while hiking in the woods, I found the house. It was exactly as I had seen it in my dreams, the same decaying structure, the same overgrown vines, the same dark windows. My heart raced as I stood before it, torn between the urge to flee and the overwhelming need to see what was inside. Compelled by some unseen force, I entered the house. It was just as I had dreamed, cold, empty, and silent. I made my way through the familiar rooms, each one triggering a deep sense of déjà vu, until I reached the door at the end of the hallway. This time I opened it. Story 26. Would you risk everything to know the truth about a local legend? Every town has its legends, and ours was no different. For as long as anyone could remember, people whispered about the abandoned mine on the outskirts of town. They said it was haunted, cursed, a place where the spirits of miners who had died in a collapse still roamed the tunnels, searching for a way out. No one dared go near it, not after what had happened to the last group of teenagers who had ventured inside. That had been 20 years ago, and none of them had ever been seen again. The town had chalked it up to an accident, but the locals knew better. I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, but there was something about the mine that had always intrigued me. Maybe it was the thrill of the unknown, or maybe it was just the desire to prove that the legend was nothing more than an old wives' tale. Either way, I found myself standing at the entrance one chilly autumn night, flashlight in hand. The air inside the mine was cold, damp, and oppressive. The walls were lined with old, rusted equipment, and the floor was slick with mud. As I ventured deeper into the tunnels, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few steps, I would hear something a faint whisper, a distant footstep echoing through the darkness. I pressed on, determined to make it to the heart of the mine, where the collapse had supposedly occurred. But as I rounded a corner, my flashlight flickered and went out. I fumbled with it, trying to get it to work, but the darkness was absolute. And then I heard a voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name from deep within the mine. Story 27. Would you believe it if the forest called out your name? Growing up, my parents warned me never to venture too far into the woods behind our house. They claimed it was dangerous, filled with wild animals and unstable ground. But there was something else they never spoke of, something that lurked deeper within the trees. One day, ignoring their warnings, I decided to explore. The forest had always intrigued me, with its thick canopy of leaves and towering trees that seemed to go on forever. As I wandered further from home, the air grew colder, the sunlight barely filtering through the dense foliage above. Then I heard it. A voice soft, distant, calling my name. At first, I thought it was the wind. But the voice came again, clearer this time, as though it was just beyond the next line of trees. Come closer, it seemed to whisper, a strange mix of urgency and calm. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a few hesitant steps forward, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But the voice continued, drawing me deeper into the woods, until I reached a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches twisting upward like skeletal hands. There, at the base of the tree, was a small stone, half buried in the earth. It was covered in strange symbols I couldn't decipher, but I felt their meaning in my bones. This was a grave. Suddenly, the air around me grew still, and the voice stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive. I stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do, when a gust of wind blew through the trees, carrying the voice with it once more. You shouldn't have come. Story 28. What if you found a key to a place that shouldn't exist? It started with an envelope slipped under my door. There was no return address, no name, just a small, weathered envelope with a single key inside. The key was old, its brass tarnished with age, but there was something about it that made me feel as though it belonged to me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began searching for the lock that fit the key. I tried every door in my apartment, but none of them matched. Weeks passed, and I began to forget about the key, letting it sit on my desk, a strange mystery I couldn't solve. Then, one night, as I returned home from work, I noticed something different. The door at the end of the hallway, a door that had never been there before, was now standing ajar, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. My heart raced as I pulled the key from my pocket, my hands trembling as I approached the door. The key slid into the lock effortlessly, and with a soft click, the door swung open, revealing a hidden room beneath the building. The air was thick and damp, and as I stepped inside, I realized this room shouldn't exist. There was no space for it. My apartment was on the top floor, and the building had no basement. Inside, the room was filled with old furniture covered in dust. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering as though it hadn't been used in years. In the corner of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface reflecting nothing but darkness. I stepped closer, drawn to the mirror, and as I reached out to touch it, my reflection did something I hadn't. It smiled. Story 29. Would you follow a stranger who looks just like you? It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when I first saw her. I had been walking through the park, enjoying the crisp autumn air, when I caught a glimpse of someone in the distance who made me stop in my tracks. It was me. At least it looked like me, same hair, same clothes, even the same way of walking. The resemblance was uncanny, and for a moment, I thought I must be imagining it. But as I got closer, I saw the truth in her face. This woman was an exact copy of me. My heart raced as I followed her, trying to understand what was happening. She weaved through the park, ignoring the other people around her, moving with purpose. Every step she took felt like a reflection of my own, as if she was leading me somewhere I was meant to go. Finally, she stopped at the edge of the park, turning to face me for the first time. Her eyes locked with mine, and a chill ran down my spine. There was something wrong in her gaze, something hollow and lifeless, like she wasn't human at all. Without a word, she turned and disappeared into the trees. I stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do, when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see her again, but there was no one there. Only a small note, pinned to my jacket. Follow her home. Story 30. Could a place from your childhood still haunt you? There was a house on the edge of town where no one ever lived for long. Growing up, it was the place all the kids talked about, the haunted house that everyone dared each other to visit, but no one actually went near. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, and the stories surrounding it were endless. But for me, the house wasn't just a story. It was real. I had lived there once, though I barely remembered it. My parents had moved us out when I was very young, and they never spoke of it again. All I knew was that something had happened there, something that had made them leave in a hurry. Now, as an adult, I found myself drawn back to the house. The old wooden fence was falling apart, the windows boarded up, but the structure itself was still standing, untouched by time. As I approached, memories began to surface, flashes of moments I hadn't thought about in years. A cold hand reaching for mine. Whispers in the dark. I pushed open the front door, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and the weight of forgotten years. The house had been left exactly as it was when we moved out, furniture covered in sheets, toys still scattered across the floor. I wandered through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness, until I reached my old bedroom. The door was closed, just as I had left it. I opened it slowly, expecting to find the room as abandoned as the rest of the house. But what I found instead was a scene frozen in time. The room was exactly as I remembered it, down to the smallest detail. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, the toys arranged neatly on the shelves. It was as though I had never left. And sitting in the middle of the room was a figure, a little girl, her back to me, playing with the same toys I had played with all those years ago. She turned to look at me, and I realized, with a shock of terror, that the girl wasn't a stranger. She was me. Story 31. Could a photograph reveal a ghost from your past? It was at an estate sale that I found the photograph. The sale was for a massive Victorian house that had been passed down through generations of a single family. I hadn't planned on buying anything, but something about the dusty box of old photos caught my eye. Flipping through the yellowed images, I paused on one in particular. It was an old black and white photo of a family standing in front of a large, imposing house, the very house I was standing in. The family looked happy, smiling for the camera, but something about the photo gave me pause. There was an extra figure in the background, standing just beyond the family's reach. It was faint, barely noticeable, but there nonetheless a shadowy figure, tall and dark, with no discernible features. Curiosity piqued. I bought the photo and brought it home, determined to learn more about the family and the history of the house. I spent hours researching, poring over old newspapers and documents, but I found nothing that could explain the figure in the photo. That night, as I lay in bed, the photograph on my nightstand, I felt a presence in the room. At first, it was just a feeling, a sense of being watched. But then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the dim light, stood the same shadowy figure from the photograph. My breath caught in my throat as it slowly moved toward me, its form flickering like a dying candle. I reached for the photo, desperate for answers, and as I held it in my hands, the figure stopped. It was waiting. Great. Let's keep the eerie momentum going. Here's the next part of the stories, filled with suspense and mystery to keep you hooked. Story 32. Would you open a door that shouldn't exist? It was supposed to be just another night at the office. I had stayed late, wrapping up a project, the building eerily quiet now that everyone else had gone home. As I locked up my desk, something caught my eye, a door at the far end of the hallway. A door that hadn't been there before. I blinked, certain I must be imagining things, but the door was still there. It was plain, unremarkable, blending in with the wall so seamlessly that I wondered how I had never noticed it before. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached it, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall. The door was unlocked. With a soft creak, it swung open, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled down into darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to walk away, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but another part, a stronger part, was drawn to whatever lay below. I grabbed my phone, using its light to guide me as I descended the stairs. The air grew colder, and the sound of the office above faded away. It felt like I had been walking forever when I finally reached the bottom, stepping into a long, dimly lit corridor. At the end of the hallway was another door. This one was different, old, weathered, with strange symbols carved into its surface. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, but I pushed forward, compelled by a force I couldn't explain. When I opened the door, I found myself standing in a room that shouldn't have existed. It was identical to my office, down to the smallest detail, but everything was covered in dust, as though it had been abandoned for years. Papers were scattered across the desk, the computer monitor flickering with static. And sitting in my chair was a figure. A figure that looked exactly like me. Story 33. What if you saw someone in the mirror who wasn't you? The old mirror had been in the house when I moved in. It hung in the hallway, its frame tarnished with age, the glass slightly warped. I had always found it unsettling, but I never gave it much thought until the day I noticed something strange. I had been walking past the mirror, on my way to the kitchen, when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. I stopped, backing up to take another look. My reflection was there, as expected, but there was something off about it. The expression on my face in the mirror didn't match the one I was wearing. I frowned, and the reflection smiled. Heart racing, I stepped back, convinced I had imagined it. But as I moved, so did the reflection, except now, it wasn't following my movements. Instead, it seemed to be moving on its own, watching me with an unsettling calmness. The days that followed only made things worse. Every time I passed the mirror, the reflection did something different, turning its head, blinking, even waving. I tried to avoid the mirror altogether, but it was impossible. It was in the hallway, the central passage of the house. One night, after weeks of enduring the strange behavior, I decided to confront it. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection, daring it to move out of sync. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the reflection raised its hand, pressing it against the glass. My heart pounded as I mirrored the motion, my hand meeting the cold surface. The reflection's smile widened, its eyes glinting with something dark and malicious. Then, without warning, the reflection stepped forward. Story 34. Would you answer the call if the dead tried to reach you? It started with a voicemail. I had been out with friends, my phone on silent, when the message came through. The notification blinked on my screen, but when I checked the number, it was one I didn't recognize. Thinking it was just a wrong number, I played the message. Static. That's all there was, just faint static crackling through the speakers. I deleted the message and didn't think much of it. But then, a few days later, I received another voicemail from the same number. This time, when I played it, there was something buried in the static. A voice faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone was trying to say my name. The messages kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. The voice grew clearer, more insistent, and soon I could hear it calling out to me, asking for help. I tried to block the number, but no matter what I did, the calls kept coming through. Desperate for answers, I traced the number back to its origin. My heart stopped when I saw the result. The number belonged to my grandmother, who had passed away 5 years ago. I knew it was impossible, but the voice on the other end sounded just like her. She had always been so kind, so full of love, but now her voice was different, darker, angrier. And every night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., my phone would ring. Story 35. Could you survive the night in a place where time stands still? The small town of Harlow was like any other quiet, unremarkable town, except for one thing: the house on Winchester Lane. It had been abandoned for decades, left to rot after the last family who lived there mysteriously vanished. The townspeople whispered about it, calling it cursed, but no one dared go near it. That's what made it the perfect place for a dare. My friends and I had been looking for something to do that Halloween, and when someone suggested spending the night in the house, I was the first to agree. After all, it was just a house. What could possibly go wrong? We arrived at the house just before sunset, armed with flashlights and snacks, ready for a night of ghost stories and laughter. The house was exactly as we'd expected: dilapidated, with broken windows and overgrown weeds, the perfect setting for a haunted tale. But as soon as we stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air was heavy, thick with a sense of foreboding. The house seemed to groan around us, the floorboards creaking under our weight. We set up camp in the living room, but it wasn't long before strange things started happening. The clocks on the walls were all stopped, frozen at the same time, 11:59 p.m. No matter how many times we tried to reset them, they refused to move. Then the temperature dropped, and we heard the first whispers. At first, we thought it was the wind. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, as though they were coming from just outside the room. We huddled together, our flashlights flickering, as the house seemed to close in around us. And then, at exactly midnight, time stopped. Story 36. Would you stay in a house where the walls remember? The old Victorian house had been in my family for generations, passed down from parent to child, each one adding their own memories to the walls. It was the kind of house that had character: creaky floors, drafty windows, and more history than anyone could remember. I had grown up hearing stories about the house, stories of strange noises, of doors opening on their own, and of shadows that moved when no one was around. But I had always dismissed them as just that, stories. That all changed when I inherited the house. At first, it was everything I had hoped for. The house was beautiful, full of charm and nostalgia, and I loved the idea of living in a place with so much history. But then, little by little, things began to change. It started with the walls. I would walk into a room and hear faint voices, like someone was having a conversation just out of earshot. But whenever I listened more closely, the voices would stop. Then I began to notice scratches on the walls, tiny, almost imperceptible, but growing more prominent with each passing day. It was as though the walls were trying to communicate, to tell me something I didn't understand. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the sound of scratching, loud and insistent, coming from the wall behind me. I bolted upright, my heart racing, as the sound grew louder. I pressed my ear to the wall, and the voices returned, clearer than ever. "Help us," they whispered, over and over again. Desperate to understand, I tore away the wallpaper, revealing something that made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in writing, names, dates, stories, all etched into the plaster by hands long gone. And at the center of it all was a message, written in bold, jagged letters. "We are still here." Story 37. What if babysitting turned into your worst nightmare? When Sarah agreed to babysit for the Thompson family, she didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The Thompsons were pleasant enough, with a cozy home nestled in the quiet suburbs. Their two children, Lily and Max, were typical kids, energetic, curious, and full of questions. The evening began as any other babysitting job would. Sarah made dinner, played games with the kids, and tucked them into bed by 8 p.m. The house was calm, the soft hum of the dishwasher, the only sound breaking the stillness. Once the kids were asleep, Sarah settled into the couch with a book, glancing occasionally at the baby monitor to ensure everything was peaceful upstairs. But then, around 9:30 p.m., something strange happened. The baby monitor crackled to life, broadcasting a low, distorted voice. Sarah frowned, leaning closer to the screen, but the image was static, fuzzy, and unreadable. The voice on the monitor was faint, as though someone was whispering from the children's room. "Come play with us." Her heart skipped a beat. She grabbed the monitor, staring at the screen, hoping to see Lily or Max moving around, but the image remained blurry. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. Sarah raced upstairs to check on the kids, but when she opened the door to their room, they were sound asleep, undisturbed by the eerie voice on the monitor. Confused and unsettled, Sarah went back downstairs, trying to convince herself it had just been interference, maybe picking up a neighbor's signal. But the voice returned, clearer this time, almost playful. "We're not alone." Fear tightened in her chest as she stared at the monitor, her pulse quickening. The camera, still fuzzy, flickered, and for a brief moment, she saw it a shadowy figure standing at the foot of Lily's bed. Story 38. What if your dream home wasn't what it seemed? My partner and I had been searching for a house for months when we finally stumbled upon it, a charming 2-story Victorian, nestled at the end of a quiet street. It had everything we wanted: spacious rooms, a beautiful garden, and that old world charm we loved. The price was surprisingly affordable, and the realtor seemed eager to sell, which made us feel like we'd found the perfect deal. We moved in a few weeks later, excited to start our lives in this new space. At first, everything was wonderful. The house was warm and inviting, with sunlight streaming through the large windows, filling the rooms with a golden glow. We spent our days unpacking and decorating, making the house feel like our own. But then the little things started happening. It began with noises soft, almost imperceptible, like footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. At first, we brushed it off as the house settling, but the sounds grew louder, more distinct. Then came the cold spots, patches of freezing air that would appear suddenly, lingering for a few minutes before disappearing just as quickly. One night, as we lay in bed, we heard a loud thud coming from the attic. We both sat up, hearts racing. "It's just the wind," my partner whispered, trying to reassure me. But deep down, we both knew it wasn't. The next morning, we decided to investigate. We pulled down the creaky attic stairs, armed with a flashlight, and made our way into the dark, dusty space. The attic was cluttered with old boxes and furniture left behind by previous owners. As we searched, the flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. And then we found it. In the far corner of the attic, hidden beneath a pile of old blankets, was a door. A small wooden door that didn't appear on any of the house's blueprints. We hadn't noticed it before, and it shouldn't have been there. With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I opened the door, revealing a narrow passage that led deep into the walls of the house. Story 39. What if your office had a secret you were never meant to discover? It started as an ordinary Tuesday morning at the office. I was sitting at my desk, sorting through emails, when I noticed something strange. The ceiling tiles above my cubicle were slightly askew, as though someone had recently moved them. I stared at them for a moment, wondering if maintenance had been up there, but I didn't think much of it. A few days later, I noticed it again. This time, the tile directly above my desk was shifted even more, revealing a sliver of darkness in the ceiling. Unease began to creep over me, but I convinced myself it was nothing, probably just an old building settling. But then, things started disappearing from my desk. At first, it was small things: pens, sticky notes, files I was certain I'd left in a specific place. Then, one afternoon, I came back from lunch to find my coffee cup missing. It was bizarre. Who would steal a coffee cup? That evening, as the office emptied and I was the last one left, I decided to check the ceiling. Grabbing a chair, I carefully stood up and pushed the tile aside. My heart raced as I peered into the dark crawl space above, half expecting to see nothing. Instead, I found something far worse. There, just a few feet from where I stood, was my coffee cup. And next to it, a pile of other items: papers, pens, a stapler, all things that had disappeared from my desk over the past few weeks. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. Beyond the pile of items was a small, makeshift bed. Blankets were piled up in the corner, along with a few empty food containers. Someone had been living in the crawl space above my desk. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a soft shuffle from the far end of the crawl space. I froze, staring into the darkness, as the sound of someone or something moved closer. Story 40. What if you found an old diary that revealed more than it should? I found the diary tucked away in the attic of the house I had just inherited. The cover was worn, the leather cracked and faded with age. It had belonged to my great-aunt Margaret, a woman I barely remembered from my childhood, but who had always seemed distant and mysterious. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to read it. The first few entries were ordinary Margaret wrote about her daily life, her friends, and the small town she lived in. But as I read further, the tone of the diary shifted. Margaret began writing about strange occurrences, things she couldn't explain. She wrote about hearing footsteps in the house at night, even though she lived alone, about waking up to find objects moved or missing. And then she wrote about the man. It started with glimpses Margaret would catch sight of a figure out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned, no one was there. Then she began seeing him more clearly, a tall, shadowy man who stood at the foot of her bed, watching her as she slept. Margaret's entries became more frantic as the sightings increased. She wrote about trying to leave the house, but every time she stepped outside, she would find herself back inside, as though the house wouldn't let her go. One of the final entries was the most chilling. He told me I can never leave. The house belongs to him now. I closed the diary, my hands shaking. The house had been empty for years after Margaret's death, but as I sat there reading her words, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Story 41. Would you buy an antique if it had a dark history? It was an impulse buy. I had been wandering through a local flea market when I saw a beautiful, old-fashioned music box. The wood was intricately carved, and the little ballerina inside was delicate, her arms poised gracefully. There was something about it that drew me in, and without thinking twice, I bought it. I brought the music box home and placed it on my dresser, admiring its craftsmanship. That evening, as I wound it up and let the music play, a strange sense of nostalgia washed over me. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, and I found myself captivated by the way the ballerina spun, twirling slowly to the tune. But that night, I woke up to the sound of the music box playing on its own. At first, I thought I must have forgotten to close the lid properly, but when I checked, it was firmly shut. The ballerina had stopped spinning, her porcelain face staring blankly at me. The next night, it happened again. This time, I woke up to the ballerina facing the opposite direction, her delicate features twisted into a frown. I tried to ignore it, but each night, the music box would play on its own, and the ballerina would move, her expression changing subtly, growing more menacing. I decided to return the music box to the flea market, but when I arrived, the vendor who had sold it to me was gone. No one at the market had ever seen him, and there was no record of the booth where I had made the purchase. Desperate, I tried to get rid of the music box, leaving it outside for someone to take. But the next morning, it was back on my dresser, the ballerina still staring at me with cold, lifeless eyes. This set of paranormal stories keeps unraveling the mysteries of haunted objects, creepy crawl spaces, and unsettling babysitting experiences. If these scary stories and true horror tales are keeping you up at night, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-chilling content. Story 42. Would you stay in a house if it had rules you couldn't break? When I rented the small cottage on the outskirts of town, I thought it was a dream come true. The rent was cheap, the area was quiet, and the house had a rustic charm that I loved. But the landlord had given me a list of strange rules upon moving in, rules that seemed almost too bizarre to follow. 1. Never leave the windows open after sunset. 2. Always keep the lights on in the hallway at night. 3. If you hear knocking on the walls, don't respond. 4. Never go into the basement after midnight. At first, I laughed them off, thinking it was just an old man's superstition. The first few days were peaceful, with nothing out of the ordinary. But one evening, I forgot to close the windows before the sun went down. As night fell, a cold wind swept through the house, and with it came strange noises, whispers, faint but unmistakable, carried on the breeze. Remembering the rules, I rushed to shut the windows, but the whispers continued, growing louder as I moved through the house. I kept the hallway lights on that night, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease that settled over me. The following night, I heard the knocking. It started around 2 a.m., soft at first, like someone tapping on the walls just outside my bedroom. My heart pounded as I lay perfectly still, recalling the landlord's rule: don't respond. The knocking continued, moving closer, until it sounded like it was right beside me. I clutched the blankets, refusing to acknowledge the sound, until it eventually stopped. But the next morning, I noticed something strange: scratch marks on the walls, as though something had been trying to get in. Story 43. Would you believe it if your hobby led you to something sinister? It started as a hobby, something to fill the quiet hours of Jessica's weekends. Metal detecting had always fascinated her, the idea of uncovering hidden treasures buried beneath the earth. She often spent her days scouring the local beaches and parks, finding little more than old coins and rusty trinkets. But one afternoon, her hobby took her somewhere unexpected. While exploring a wooded area near her home, Jessica's metal detector beeped loudly, indicating a large object just beneath the surface. Excited, she knelt down and began to dig. Her heart raced as the edge of something metallic came into view: a small, intricately carved box. The box was old, its brass tarnished with age, but it was still intact. She carefully pried it open, expecting to find more coins or perhaps an antique locket. Instead, she found something much stranger: a bundle of letters, yellowed with time, tied together with a faded ribbon. Curiosity piqued, Jessica took the letters home and began to read. The first few were love letters, written in a beautiful flowing script. But as she read further, the tone of the letters shifted. They spoke of dark rituals, of strange gatherings held in the woods at night. The writer described a group of people who had been performing secret ceremonies for years, calling on something ancient and dangerous. The last letter was the most chilling. It spoke of a man someone the writer had once loved who had gone missing after one of the ceremonies. The writer blamed the group, saying they had taken him, though she didn't explain how. At the bottom of the letter was a warning, scrawled hastily in a different hand. Don't dig any deeper. Leave it buried. That night, Jessica couldn't sleep. The box sat on her kitchen table, its contents unsettling her more than she wanted to admit. In the early hours of the morning, she heard something: a faint rustling, like someone was moving around her house. When she went downstairs, the box was gone. Story 44. What if the painting on your wall was watching you? The painting was a gift from my aunt, a beautiful, old landscape of a forest clearing. The colors were muted, the scene peaceful, and I immediately hung it in my living room. It was the perfect addition to my home, a touch of nature in an otherwise modern apartment. But after a few weeks, I started noticing something odd. At first, it was subtle. The trees in the painting seemed to shift ever so slightly when I wasn't looking. The shadows beneath the branches grew darker, and the sunlight filtering through the leaves seemed to fade. I told myself it was just my imagination after all. It was an old painting, and the light in my apartment could make it look different depending on the time of day. But then I noticed something even stranger. There was a figure in the painting. I hadn't seen it before, but there it was, standing just beyond the trees, a faint, shadowy outline of a person, barely visible. My heart raced as I stared at the painting, trying to remember if the figure had always been there. The more I looked, the more certain I became that it hadn't been. The days that followed were even worse. Every time I looked at the painting, the figure was closer. First, it had been standing at the edge of the trees, but now it was in the clearing, moving closer to the center of the painting with each passing day. I tried taking the painting down, but no matter where I put it, the figure kept advancing. By the end of the week, it was standing in the foreground, its face turned toward me, watching. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the living room. Story 45. Cole, would you take a midnight ride with a ghost? Late night drives had always been my way of clearing my mind. There was something peaceful about the empty roads, the quiet hum of the engine, and the cool air streaming through the open window. It was during one of these drives that I first saw him, the hitchhiker. It was just after midnight when I spotted him standing by the side of the road, his thumb outstretched. He was young, dressed in jeans and a leather jacket, his face obscured by the shadow of a baseball cap. Normally, I wouldn't have stopped, but there was something about him, an air of desperation that made me pull over. He climbed into the passenger seat without a word, nodding his thanks as I pulled back onto the road. For a while, we drove in silence, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I couldn't help but glance over at him occasionally, trying to get a better look at his face, but every time I did, he seemed to shift just out of view. Finally, I asked, "Where are you headed?" He didn't respond right away, just stared out the window as the trees blurred past. Then, in a low voice, he said, "I'm just trying to get home." Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't press him for more details, and we continued driving in silence. But then, after a few more miles, he spoke again, this time barely above a whisper. "I didn't make it home last time." Confused, I glanced at him, but his seat was empty. The hitchhiker had vanished. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing, but the road was deserted. There was no sign of him anywhere. Shaken, I drove home as quickly as I could, trying to shake the eerie feeling that had settled over me. The next morning, I did some research on the area where I had picked him up. To my horror, I found an old news article about a young man who had died in a car accident on that very stretch of road over 30 years ago. Story 46. Would you answer the door if someone kept knocking at 3 a.m.? It started with a single knock, sharp and insistent, waking me from a deep sleep. I checked the clock, 3 a.m. I lay still for a moment, trying to convince myself I had imagined it, but then came another knock, louder this time. Confused and a little scared, I got out of bed and tiptoed to the front door, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. For a while, I stood by the door, listening for any signs of movement outside, but the night was silent. I went back to bed, dismissing the incident as a prank, but the next night it happened again. At exactly 3 a.m., the knocking returned 3 sharp raps that echoed through the empty house. Once again, I found no one at the door. This continued for several nights, always at the same time, always the same number of knocks. By the end of the week, I was terrified. I barely slept, dreading the inevitable sound of those knocks. I tried ignoring them, but they only grew louder, more demanding. I even considered calling the police, but what could I tell them? That someone or something was knocking at my door every night, but there was no one there. One night, desperate for answers, I decided to open the door. At 3 a.m., when the knocking came, I steeled myself and turned the lock, yanking the door open. The street was empty, the night quiet and still. But when I looked down, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There on the doorstep was a note. Scrawled in messy, uneven handwriting were the words, "Let me in. Story 47. Would you open an invitation to a party that no one remembers?" It was an ordinary Friday evening when the invitation arrived. I found it in my mailbox, tucked between the usual bills and junk mail. The envelope was plain, with no return address, and my name was written in elegant cursive on the front. Intrigued, I opened it. Inside was a single card, inviting me to a party at an unfamiliar address. The event was scheduled for that very night, at 11 p.m. Sharp. No details, no host's name, just the time and place. I should have ignored it. After all, it seemed strange to receive an invitation like that without any explanation. But something about it piqued my curiosity, so I decided to go. The address led me to a grand, old mansion on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, tall, dark, with ivy creeping up the sides and windows that glinted ominously in the moonlight. As I approached, I noticed there were no other cars parked outside. I checked the invitation again. This was definitely the right place. Inside, the mansion was beautifully decorated, as though a party had been in full swing moments before I arrived. There were elegant chandeliers, polished floors, and tables set with elaborate centerpieces. But there was no one there. I wandered through the rooms, calling out, but the only response was my own echo. Just as I was about to leave, I heard the faint sound of music, soft, distant, like it was coming from another part of the house. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing eerily in the empty halls. It led me to a ballroom, grand and opulent, but completely deserted. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, when a figure appeared in the doorway, a tall man dressed in old-fashioned evening attire. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me. "You're late," he said in a voice that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to leave, but when I looked back, the man in the mansion had disappeared. I was standing in an empty field, with no sign of the grand house that had been there moments before. Story 48. What if a storm wasn't the only thing knocking on your window? It had been a long day, and the storm outside made it even worse. The rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees, making the house creak with every gust. I sat by the fireplace, trying to read, but the noise from the storm was too distracting. And then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then the knocking came again, 3 sharp taps against the window. My heart raced as I turned toward the sound, expecting to see nothing but the storm. But through the rain-soaked glass, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A face. It was faint, barely visible through the sheets of rain, but it was there, a pale, ghostly face staring in at me. I jumped up from my chair, rushing to the window, but by the time I got there, the face had vanished. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me after a long, exhausting day. But the knocking returned. 3 more taps. This time louder, more urgent. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the curtain, before finally pulling it back. The window was empty, the storm still raging outside, but there was no sign of the face I had seen. The rest of the night was a blur of nerves and restless sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face staring in at me, unblinking. And every time I drifted off, I would wake up to the sound of that knocking, always 3 taps, always at the window. In the morning, when the storm had passed, I stepped outside to check for any signs of what I had seen, but all I found were muddy footprints leading away from the house. Story 49. What if your reflection didn't want to stay in the mirror? I've always had an odd relationship with mirrors. There's something unsettling about seeing your reflection, knowing it's an exact copy of you, but not quite you. Still, I'd never had any real issues with them until recently. It started with small things. I'd glance in the mirror and catch my reflection moving out of sync. At first, I thought I was imagining it, chalking it up to being tired or distracted. But the more I noticed it, the harder it was to ignore. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I saw it again, my reflection lagging just a second behind. I waved my hand in front of the mirror and my reflection followed, but just slightly too late. Then it smiled. I wasn't smiling. My blood ran cold as I stared at the reflection, its grin widening, its eyes glinting with something dark and unnatural. I backed away from the mirror, but my reflection stayed where it was, watching me. In a panic, I covered the mirror with a blanket, refusing to look at it again. But that didn't stop the feeling of being watched, of knowing that something was lurking just beyond the glass. The next day, I decided to remove the mirror altogether. I hauled it out of the house and left it by the curb, hoping to be rid of it for good. But that night, when I returned home, the mirror was back hanging in the same spot, as though it had never left. And this time, the reflection was already smiling when I walked in. Story 50. What if a market appeared at the end of your street once a year, but only for you? Once a year, on a moonless night, a market appears at the end of my street. It's not there during the day, and no one in the neighborhood seems to know about it or care. But I see it every year, like clockwork. The first time it happened, I thought it was some kind of pop-up event, a local thing that I had just missed hearing about. The market was small, tucked away in a forgotten corner, with colorful tents and stalls selling strange trinkets and oddities. The vendors were quiet, barely acknowledging my presence as I wandered through. I didn't buy anything that first time, but the market stayed with me, haunting my thoughts for weeks afterward. There was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put into words. The next year, it appeared again. This time, I decided to explore more carefully. The items for sale were even stranger, old books with titles in languages I couldn't read, jars filled with things that shimmered in the moonlight, and dolls that seemed to watch me as I passed. One stall caught my attention. The vendor, a tall man with a wide-brimmed hat, offered me a small, ornate box. "For you," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Take it." I hesitated, unsure if I should accept, but something in his eyes made it impossible to refuse. I took the box, and the man smiled before turning away, disappearing into the shadows of the market. When I opened the box later that night, I found a single slip of paper inside. Written in neat, looping handwriting were the words, "This market is only for you. And next year, we'll be waiting." Story 51. Would you enter a house that wasn't on the map? I've always loved exploring abandoned places. There's something thrilling about stepping into a forgotten building, piecing together the lives of the people who once lived there. So when I heard about an old, abandoned house deep in the woods, I knew I had to find it. The house wasn't on any map, but locals whispered about it, a place where time had stopped, where the past lingered in every corner. I gathered my gear and set out early one morning, determined to find the house. The woods were dense, the air heavy with the scent of pine and earth. I hiked for hours, following a trail that grew fainter with every step, until finally I saw it. The house stood at the edge of a clearing, old and weathered, with ivy crawling up its walls and windows that seemed to watch my every move. I approached cautiously, my excitement tempered by a growing sense of unease. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust, and the house seemed untouched by time. Furniture sat exactly where it had been left, cobwebs draping the corners like forgotten memories. As I explored, I noticed something strange. There were no photographs, no personal belongings, nothing to suggest that anyone had ever lived here. It was as though the house had been staged, set up to look abandoned but never truly inhabited. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, I found a journal, its pages yellowed with age. The last entry was dated over 100 years ago, and it spoke of a house that wasn't supposed to exist. A house that appeared in the woods once a generation, drawing people in only to trap them within its walls. I looked around, realizing too late that the house had no intention of letting me leave. Story 52. What if the phone kept ringing, but no? One was on the other end? It started with a wrong number. I had been at home, enjoying a quiet evening, when the phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but I answered it anyway. On the other end, there was nothing but silence. "Hello," I said, waiting for a response, but no one spoke. After a few moments, the line went dead. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just a prank or a misdial, but the next night, the phone rang again, same number, same silence. This time, I hung up immediately, unsettled by the thought of someone calling me every night without saying a word. But the calls kept coming. Every night, without fail, the phone would ring at exactly 9 p.m., and every night I would answer only to be greeted by the same unnerving silence. I tried blocking the number, but it didn't help. The calls continued, always from a different number, always the same result. One night, desperate for answers, I stayed on the line, refusing to hang up. I listened to the silence, my pulse racing, until finally I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible. "I'm coming." The line went dead. This batch of scary stories explores strange markets, eerie invitations, and unsettling phone calls. If these true scary stories and ghostly encounters are keeping you on the edge of your seat, be sure to subscribe for more paranormal tales and mysterious stories.